Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Chess Council of India, I, Dr. Archana, welcome all of you to this yet another masterclass on cross-speciality topics. The year 2020 saw one of the worst pandemics in the history of mankind in the form of COVID-19. Initially, it was thought to be a respiratory infection, but later went on to become a systemic disease affecting each and every possible organ system, globally infecting more than 114 million people with more than 2.5 million deaths. 2020 was like opening the fridge every 5 minutes just to see if anything new was in there, except there was always something new, but it was always bad. But the life has to go on because we are resilient. Some of our patients continue to experience symptoms related to COVID-19 even after the acute phase of illness, and we call it as long COVID or post-COVID syndrome. Most of them are not so serious, but some patients do suffer from serious complications. Last week, we listened to one such complications, that is vascular complications in COVID-19. Today, in continuation with the post-COVID complications, Dr. D. Suresh Kumar will be speaking on secondary infections post-COVID. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Suresh Kumar. He is Senior Consultant Infectious Disease Physician working at Apollo Hospital, Chennai. He has done his MD FNB in Infectious Disease, also done his fellowship in HIV/AIDS medicine, certified by American Board in Tropical Medicine. He is also co-founder of Best of IDs and he has a long list of achievements. To name a few, he has received Young Investigator Award from International AIDS Society 2007, International Infectious Disease Fellows Award from American Society of Microbiology 2010, Best International Research Paper on HIV/AIDS from Infectious Disease Society of America 2011, received first prize from API for Dr. J.C. Patil and B.C. Mehta Best Paper Award under the category of Original Article for the year 2013 for the article entitled Melioidosis, an Emerging Infection in India. He has also received Professor Dr. S.K. Ranjan Gold Medal Oration Award at Papicon 2015. He has received travel grants from Infection Control and Prevention Geneva in 2015, 2011 and 2017. His expertise in the field of tropical infections, nosocomial infections, transplant and HIV infections. He has more than 35 international and national publications into his basket. Over to you, sir.
Good evening, one and all. I sincerely thank the organizers for giving this wonderful opportunity. I'm going to discuss today secondary infections in post-COVID era. This is my talk, but very confusing one. Whether we are in post-COVID era, we are not sure. I can put it post-COVID first wave era, I can say that. My disclosures, I am not in a Zoom dress code. I don't have any disclosures for today's talk there. Thanks for the opportunity there. So I'm going to begin with straight away with a case here. 61-year-old male, known diabetic and hypertensive. He came to me in the first week of February with a complaints of fever, body pain of 7 days durations. To be precise, he got admitted here on 7th of February there. So the illness started on 1st of February there. And he presented why? Because of shortness of breath. That day he got hospitalized. So he participated as a volunteer in one of the vaccine trials going in the Chennai part there. In the month of October, he received first shot of the vaccines and second dose he received in the month of November 2020 there. Right now, he was treated with remdesivir initially on admissions since he was short of breath on day 7. So people started with the remdesivir along with dexamethasone 8 milligram OD. And some of my physician colleagues started doxycycline because he was admitted as a physician colleague. He started doxy also. Then the shortness of breath worsened, but fever improved. Fever subsided in next 3 to 4 days, but the shortness of breath progressively worsened. Initially, he was requiring nasal cannula, then progressively went into the mask, then NRBM mask, then HFNC. Finally, was intubated on 12 days later on his admission on 19th of February. Relapse of fever happened 10 days back. Again on 23rd of February, he got admitted on 7th. Almost 15 days later into the hospital admissions, he started developing fever. That point of time, we are coming down after intubations and ventilations. We are coming down on the oxygen nicely, but that point of time, the oxygen requirement also went up. When we repeated the CT scan, it showed consolidation as well as increasing worsening. Sorry, that picture I cannot able to put it there, but the person's CT scan showed consolidations and worsening of clinical picture. And WBC count is also shown rising trend. And CRP went up. Initially, it presented with CRP of 24 with a normal of 6. It went up to 72 within 15 days time. What's your diagnosis at point of time there? So in a healthy person, but even though diabetic and hypertensive, it's in a well under control. That is why he allowed as a participant for this trial. He started participating and receiving the vaccines in the month of November, but still after receiving vaccinations, he got into the hospitalizations with progressively worsening shortness of breath, requiring ventilations. Initially showed signs of improvement. Later he got worsening oxygenations and fever labs and worsening CT scan with elevations in WBC and CRP. What is your diagnosis? And wait for a minute. You can people go ahead and put in the chat column so that we can discuss at the end of the day today. So my objective is I like to define what is post-COVID and what is secondary infections there. A lot of confusion is going on. Second thing, epidemiology of secondary infections, whether this talk really needed or not. Then I'll just show what is the pathophysiology of these things there and what are all the challenges every clinician has got while dealing with the secondary infections. And I'll summarize at the end what treatment approach we are following. So this is my objective for today's talk there. So this is COVID phases. If you see the COVID phases, initial week is a viremic phase where the viral load will be maximum. At the second week, what happened? And the viral load goes down, but inflammatory phase sets in. And the third phase, whether the inflammation's lasting little longer, that means hyperinflammation phase, particularly people who are hospitalized, people who are into critical care unit, they went into the hyperinflammation phase. But there is no phase mentioned about post-COVID. Whether completely the person is resolved, then again the illness is going on, or during the admission itself it started, it's very difficult there. In all phases, the viral infections confuses with bacterial infections. Usually people used to do CRP to differentiate whether it's a bacterial versus viral. Unfortunately, in COVID, CRP is also elevated. It's a bit difficult to say whether it's a bacterial versus viral. Usually we write the diagnosis called community-acquired pneumonia. Once COVID report is positive, we can convert it as a COVID-associated pneumonia, very mild pneumonia, moderate pneumonia, or severe pneumonia, based upon the severity scoring, as well as based upon the clinical oxygen requirement there. But all phases can overlap with secondary infections, particularly with bacterial infection is possible there. And there is no phase defined for post-COVID. So what term we are using for post-COVID? For post-COVID, we are using it, person is recovered completely and started developing symptoms and signs of organ infections. Usually people use the term called long COVID there. People who recovered went home, but some sort of symptoms like fatigue, tiredness, shortness of breath, or even lack of taste and lack of smell. If these things are there, it is called as a post-COVID or long COVID. Usually people call there. But what happened in the case of secondary infections, people may still in the hospital or people may get discharged and readmitted with some new problem. During the hospital stay, whatever event they got admitted, they gradually recover, and again the second infections or second episode of worsening can happen, or the person can get discharged with minimal support or without support, and within weeks time or within 2 weeks time, most of the time. But sometimes we have seen people are admitting within 3 to 4 weeks later, sometimes little longer also. That is why I'm saying this post-COVID is not clearly defined. So in short, post-COVID means the person admitted for COVID. That point of time, there is no other cross infections. Person clinically showing signs of improvement with COVID. That sudden deteriorations happening in the hospital or even after the discharge, but there is no specific timeline how long this is going to happen. Either 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 12 weeks, we are not sure because some of the complications happening little longer, little later. That is a concern there. So I find out what you mean by secondary infections. Lot of terms is there. Co-infections, secondary infections, super infection there. Co-infection means when the person can present with along with COVID. Suppose if you investigate, the picture is not alone COVID there. For example, the person has got cavity and consolidations in additions along with ground glass opacities, or the person has got very high WBC count. Usually in COVID infections, the WBC count at presentation is either normal or below normal. But if the person presents with very high WBC count and the CT is not classic of COVID, in addition, the person has got some consolidations or cavitations, what do you think? The person might have co-infections will be there. Sometimes the person might have urinary tract infections along with COVID also. So these are all called COVID infections. On the other hand, secondary infections or super infections, both are similar to me there. Once COVID sets in, it makes your soil, it makes your lung as a fertile soil, where the secondary bacterial process or fungal process rarely, apart from this bacteria and funguses like mycobacteria sits in, or mycobacteria get reactivated because of the interventions, that is called the secondary infections or super infection there. So it's a bit difficult to label whether it's a co-infections or super infections. People confuse their terminology, one. And second thing, if you think the person has got secondary infections, whether it's a community acquired or hospital acquired, sometimes the patients got discharged and go home and come back. It may be community acquired. Sometimes during the hospital stay itself, what the case I have shown a couple of minutes back, that is classic case of hospital acquired infection there. So we need to know whether it's a community acquired or hospital acquired, whether it is present at the time of COVID diagnosis or it was present little later after the COVID diagnosis was made. Usual timeline, what is the timeline we are adopting? After COVID, usually after 7 to 10 days. Sometimes it may be little earlier. For example, day 4 onwards or day 5 onwards, but there is no upper limit so far when to call the secondary infection is upper limit time there. So these are all the definitions we need to keep in mind. So that's very easy for us to approach secondary infection. Why we are discussing today? A lot of things there. I have not shown any newspaper postings here. If you see the newspaper, particularly Indian newspapers, they are discussing about the secondary infections, particularly secondary fungal infections like mucormycosis on rice, fungal infections on rice. A lot of newspaper article describing these things, but I have shown the medical literature what it shows. Usually the threat is under-recognized. That's the bottom line there. A lot of bacterial and fungal co-infections happening. So far, the TB people are not focusing, but I have shown a couple of cases of TB also I'll show in my last presentations. And mucormycosis is a hit. If you see most of the Indian journals, they're talking about post-COVID mucor. In fact, one of my groups, one of ID groups we call, they started doing a surveillance study across India. How many mucormycosis happened in the COVID era? They are just checking pre-COVID era and during COVID era, they're checking how many mucormycosis happened there. And a lot of colonization is also there, very difficult to differentiate whether the bacteria is causing the disease or something is causing the disease there. So we need to be aware of secondary infections. Unfortunately, the threat is under-recognized. That's why we are discussing today there. So I'm showing the tip of the iceberg. If you see, this is one of the big publications happen in Clinical Microbiology and Infection Journal there. You are saying co-infection means presenting at the time of COVID diagnosis, or the infection is mostly community origin infection. They are thinking about it. They admitted for the COVID. The classic presentations of COVID is missing. They suspected something called COVID co-infections. But super infections or secondary infections admitted with the COVID, then person clinically start improving. Later, the person starts showing her signs of some secondary infections. So this is called secondary infections. The incidence can vary depending upon the how far you are going to investigate, how far you are vigilant, and what is your antibiotic stewardship practices. Because most of the hospitals, when a patient's admitted with COVID in the ICU, they start antibiotics. So the antibiotic may mask the secondary infections. Sometimes people think it may prevent, but in real scenario, it won't prevent. It increases your resistance pattern in your hospital. That's what I can say. It can mask during your hospital stay. Next time when the person got deteriorated, either lack of bed in your hospitals or the person doesn't want to come to you, he might go to the other hospitals. We have encountered so many patients treated elsewhere, worsening after 7 to 10 days, come back to our institutions. So the antibiotic, what the institution used, masks the presence of secondary infections during the hospital stay. Once the person got discharged, the secondary infections are unmasked and we are able to diagnose it there. So if you see, the community acquired infection, that means co-infections usually vary with 3% to 2%. Usually the chances of having secondary infections along with COVID is very, very, very limited. Ideally, I put like maximum is 3% there. Usually 1 to 2%, maximum 3%. But secondary bacterial infections can happen little bit more compared to the co-infections. It can happen 15%. I'll come back and explain what are the risk factors for secondary bacterial infections. But unfortunately, if you see, antibiotic usage. The antibiotic usage is very high. Antibiotic usage more than 50%, even though the incidence of infections, co-infections is hardly 1 to 3%, and secondary infection, the incidence vary anywhere between 4 and 15%, but still antibiotic usage is disproportionate to what we are seeing now. So if you see the bacterial infections, particularly the HAP and PAP is more common compared to your central line infections. Yes, HAP and PAP is more common. Central line bloodstream infections can happen. Urinary tract infections can happen. Why? We are doing interventions and we are keeping the patients in ICU. The patient is an immunosuppressed patient. So these things can happen. Apart from these things, I'll show what other risk factors is common for cause of secondary bacterial infections in my subsequent slides there. So co-infections, it vary anywhere between 1 to 3%. I'm talking about bacterial co-infections. And secondary infections, usually it varies anywhere between 4 and 15% following COVID infections, depending upon how far we are investigating, what is the timeline we are giving it, and third thing, what antibiotic stewardship we are practicing. That's most important thing there. This is clear-cut observations. How long the follow-up? That's why I said the post-COVID, the duration has not been defined. Some people are following 7 days, some people are following 14 days. Some of the infections happening after 28 days also, particularly fungal infections, where the immunosuppressions happen, it make the soil fertile and seeded the fungus. The fungus takes some time to manifest. Similarly, we are going to see the tuberculosis in the future. Right now, we are given a lot of immunosuppressions, a lot of immunomodulatory agents there that can stimulate or reactivate the tuberculosis. The tuberculosis reactivations can happen 3 to 6 months, or up to some other cases, it can go up to 9 months also there. Particularly the biological agents, what we are used, particularly the monoclonal antibody, tocilizumab, it make your immune system vulnerable for 6 months to 9 months. So we may get a lot of cases in the future, depending upon whatever therapy we used. So there is no upper limit for post-COVID. Depending upon the timeline, we need to think about whether it's a reactivations or whether the relapse of co-infections or because of a new secondary infections or unrelated to the COVID at all. Sometimes people are coming admitted for some other reasons after the COVID. Don't put the blame everything on COVID. That's the point I'm making here. So how about the organisms? Yes, organisms associated with vary. It depends upon hospital acquired or community acquired. Community acquired, mostly it is a common bacterial pathogens as well as atypical pathogens like Mycoplasma, Legionella, and other viruses will possible there. Other respiratory viruses. Fortunately, this year, we have not seen more of influenza cases, H1N1. I do not know whether the mask, whatever mask we call, we are not appropriately used the mask. Unfortunately, we are using inappropriate mask most of the time, whether that gives protection for influenza, because influenza is a droplet. Whether whatever mask we are wearing, it is protecting us, we do not know, one. And second thing, other bacterial infections and atypical bacteria like Mycoplasma, Legionella is possible. Third thing, if the person stays in a hospital, mostly it is a hospital acquired bug like Acinetobacter, Klebsiella, or E. coli. That's most common there. Some of the fungal infections can happen that is not related to the either community, but maybe due to the hospital acquired environment or because of the immunosuppressions also can cause it. So these are all the tips of the iceberg, what we are seeing. If you see the epidemiological or microbiological profile of secondary infections, both bacteria, funguses, and most of the literature from the Western world, particularly the developed world, we don't get tuberculosis. In the developing world, yes, TB is common, but most of the literatures, what I get it from, what is available so far is from the developed world. Developed world discuss about bacteria, they discuss about other viruses, they discuss about fungal infections. The chances of TB infections very hardly few in the reported literature. So if you see the aspergillosis, yes, a lot of aspergillosis cases has been reported everywhere. I'll show my institution presentations, what happened little later part of it there. Yes, aspergillosis is quite common. Why it is happening? COVID is one of the important risk factor for aspergillosis. This emerging risk factors for aspergillosis. In fact, the term COVID-associated pulmonary aspergillosis is called CAPA. It is now well-recognized entity across the world because COVID can cause lytic effects on the respiratory tissues, make the tissues vulnerable to aspergillosis. Similarly, in Indian scenario, mucormycosis is quite common compared to aspergillosis because the awareness about mucor is very much high. newspapers are discussing about mucormycosis. The threshold for mucormycosis is very low among clinicians. One of the reasons what we are talking about it because of the awareness. Why so many mucormycosis before COVID era and COVID era? Because of the awareness, because of the newspapers, because of the social media, they're discussing about the mucormycosis. And India, it is more common. We are the world leaders in type 2 diabetes mellitus. And during COVID, we have found out a lot of newly diagnosed diabetic, that too very high sugar. And during treatment also, people who got impaired glucose tolerance, a well-controlled diabetic, they lost the control and the sugar went up to very high levels. So this is one of the most important risk factors for mucormycosis. We have seen that everywhere we are seeing mucormycosis, but Western literature, the mucormycosis incidence is bit low unless we got the data from our national surveillance data, what we started recently. We need to compare with Indian data with Western world. According to my gut, it shows more mucor in India compared to aspergillosis, but we need to wait and watch for the entire data there. What about other new entity? People talking about aspergillosis, people talking about mucormycosis. One more entity called CAC, COVID-associated candidiasis. Lot of interventions we did. For example, central line, we put Foley catheter. These are all the two important risk factors. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of antibiotic abuse. Even though co-infection is 3% and super infections and secondary infections maximum is 15%, antibiotic abuse is more than 50 to 60% there. So what are all the important risk factors for candidiasis? Two important risk factors. One, central line. Two, antibiotic exposure. The other risk factors like mechanical ventilations, staying in the ICU, receiving antibiotics more than 3 to 5 days, because most of the surgical procedures were not done for the COVID patients, that risk factor is not there. Other important risk factor for candidiasis is surgery. But here, people receiving antibiotic, receiving central lines, staying in the ICU, immunosuppressed, receiving a lot of steroids, this indicate patient chances of getting candidiasis. This entity is called COVID-associated candidiasis. But what is worrisome? A lot of resistant candida. Previously, people used to get candida albicans and candida tropicalis. This albicans and tropicalis usually fluconazole or azole sensitive we can call. We can treat easily with fluzoles. Azoles we can treat and get away with it. On the other hand, if you got COVID-associated candidiasis, the species like glabrata, that's more common. It is resistant to fluconazole also most of the time. That's most important. And one new strain called Candida auris is also start emerging. Auris is most difficult to treat because it is resistant to everything there. Very few options, and the person showing failure to whatever standard of care like echinocandins, what we use most of the time, that is also failing it there. In fact, echinocandin is a drug of choice, but we have seen people got candidemia. I'm talking about candida in the blood. Candidemia with Candida auris is very difficult to treat. That is why I'm saying about you need to have a good antibiotic stewardship. We need to have a good infection control practices. That's most important thing there. Then the last part, how about TB and COVID? Yes, higher mortality. If you see the epidemiological studies, whereas the COVID mortality is very high, COVID mortality is very high in the developed world. For example, US and Europe, where the mortality is very high. On the other hand, whereas the mortality is very high for your tuberculosis, developing world, like Africa and Asia is a vulnerable for the TB. So there is some amount of protections happening in developed world compared to the some amount of protections happening in the developing country compared to the developed world. So we need to know what is the differences. People are talking about lots of things. I'll come back in a couple of slides later there. So this is called Indian syndemic we call. During the time of COVID, the notifications as well as diagnosis of tuberculosis has come down. People thinking about COVID, they forgot to think about other comorbid conditions like diabetes, other medical conditions like hypertension, coronary heart disease, everything is postponed. Similarly, tuberculosis notification also gone down. Very difficult to identify tuberculosis. So people are not thinking about tuberculosis. One, the presentation, the risk factors is same for both. People who are diabetic, people who got underlying comorbid conditions, transplants, immunosuppressions, the risk of tuberculosis can go up. Similarly, COVID in diabetic immunosuppressors, the prognosis is bad. So the risk factors make both the disease bad. But treatment, steroids, immunomodulator therapy like your tocilizumab, that increases the risk of tuberculosis. Unfortunately, during the time of COVID, the notifications as well as diagnosis has not happened. Once a diagnosis is delayed, the mortality will go up. This is one of the case studies I got it there. Couple of case series is only we got it. There is no large studies are available. Mostly the case series is available there. This is a 49 cases of active tuberculosis. That is a sequelae of COVID. Mostly because people received steroids and most of the people received immunomodulator therapy in the form of tocilizumab there. And other case series of 81 cases and 50 cases keep happening there unless we search for it, unless we go and find out if the suspicion is very high. One more thing, most of the time we make a diagnosis of tuberculosis by demonstrating the tuberculosis bacilli. In the sometimes the sample of sputum is not a good quality there. We need to go for bronchoscopy and get the BAL specimen there. Unfortunately, during the COVID time, particularly in the initial months, from the month of April to June, or in the month of April to September, I can put it, people failed to do the bronchoscopy because of the infection control issues and transmission issues. They failed to do the bronchoscopy. So we have not made the diagnosis in initial part. Once in the later part, when we know the disease part better and people start doing bronch little later, we are able to make so many diagnoses of tuberculosis. So as far as tuberculosis is concerned, it is happening, but we need to be vigilant. We need to find out the source and we need to find it out there. Then I'll come back to the pathophysiology. So far, I told what do you mean by second infection, what do you mean by co-infections, and what is an epidemiology. The epidemiology shows bacterial infections is not that common. 3% to 15% it varies there, but the problem we are using antibiotic most of the time. And fungal infections is on rise, particularly all three fungal infections, Candida, Aspergillus, mucormycosis. In Indian scenario, both Candida and mucormycosis is very high. Aspergillosis data, we are waiting for it. I'll come back with the challenges in the management, why aspergillosis is not that common there. And second thing, what is a pathophysiology? As far as bacterial infection is concerned, and as far as Candida is concerned, the two important risk factors is present in the COVID. One, patients are staying in ICU longer duration. Because of the hypoxia, either need non-invasive ventilations or invasive ventilations. So most of the time, because of the hypoxia and ARDS is severe, they need to stay in a ICU for quite some time compared to your general cases there. So the length of stay is very high. Similarly, the ventilation duration is much higher. People thinking about initial ventilation itself, early ventilations, lot of confusion is happening whether early ventilation versus late ventilations, and the ball is always swinging there. So people say early ventilation is better, so they start ventilating early the patients. So longer durations of ventilations, longer durations of this ICU stay, and the ARDS is also more severe. So what happened when the patient has got longer ICU stay, longer ventilations, and bad ARDS, the chances of ventilator-associated events or ventilator-associated pneumonia is quite common. But fortunately, if we see the bug, patients in COVID and non-COVID almost similar. That means depending upon what ICU the patient got admitted. If your ICU is loaded with a lot of resistant bug, you are going to get the resistant bug. If your ICU is not loaded with resistant bugs, the chances of getting resistant bug is a bit less. Unfortunately, we do a lot of other things there. I'll show in my next slide the problem. People think COVID increases the hand hygiene. Definitely, yes, COVID increases the hand hygiene in non-ward, non-ICU settings there. People have to do anything they remove to do and do the hand hygiene. But in the COVID ward, the hand hygiene for me is zero. Why? They are in PPE with full gloves. With the same glove, the people keep on going from one patient to other patients. They don't want to remove the glove. Some people, they're doing the hand rub over the glove. That is not appropriate there. So the hand hygiene in COVID ICUs, hand hygiene in COVID environment, because of the same PPE, whatever bugs they carry in the PPE, they go to the different places. In non-COVID era, we need to change the gown from one place to other place, or we need to change the glove. Unfortunately, it is not happening in the COVID era. Second thing is less opportunity for isolations. When a person carrying a resistant bug, for example, MRSA, carbapenem resistant gram-negative organisms, we isolate the patient to the single room. Unfortunately, in COVID era, we want to provide a quality of care, and lack of staff, that's one of the best thing happened in the COVID era. So we need to cohort the patients, sick patients with the experienced staff. But unfortunately, the same staff should handle 2 or 3 patients. Normally, the staff can handle one patient is one issue, one nurse with one patient. But during COVID times, the 1:1 nursing ratio is gone in most of the ICU. Even the developed country, they don't provide 1:1 nursing there. So that is one of the important vital risk factors for getting resistant bug and secondary infection there. and constant use of PPE that may be loaded with it. At the end of the day, you're removing the PPE, but for a 6 hours or 8 hour shift, you're using the same PPE. Then empirical antibiotics. I told people are using antibiotic multiple times, even though the risk is 15%, people are using 70% of the time there. And failure to recognize. People don't doing any diagnostic procedures, immediate stages, particularly in the initial months, we fail to do the diagnostic methods. Why the aspergillosis, we are not able to make a diagnosis? One, the test is not available freely, galactomannan and beta-glucan, the biomarkers that is not available freely, and the performance of the biomarker in the aspergillosis itself is poor. And third thing is the patient demography, what we are getting it. We are getting more new onset diabetes. Our people's diabetes is get worsened during the time of COVID. So these are all the factors that play in secondary bacterial as well as candida infection there. Critical illness, high antibiotic usage, lot of interventions. People normally change the lines frequently there. They want to change the lines when they think the line is colonized with some bacteria or candida. But during COVID time, we are not doing the regular care. We are not handling with the IV lines. We are not handling the endotracheal tube with appropriate care. The suctioning, everything is not appropriate to me there. Second thing, people are changing their infection control practices. They're not isolating the patients. They're not using the proper gown for individual patients. So these are all the factors that increases the secondary bacterial infections in the hospital there. Then people talking about steroids and immunomodulatory. Even though we know steroid increases the diabetes increases the risk of candida, as well diabetes increases the risk of invasive fungal infections, diabetes can causes increases bacterial infections. But in retrospective observational data, it shows rise. But if you do a randomized control trial, there is no major changes. People who receive steroids, people who receive tocilizumab. This is according to the RCTs, randomized control trial. But if you look closely, the observational data shows people are using steroids, people are using tocilizumab. The secondary bacterial, the secondary fungal infections, particularly invasive fungal infections, mold infections is very high. But if you do a RCT, it is not there. They don't consider steroids and immunomodulator as a risk factor. But the data is from the developed world. The data from the developing country is missing there. What are the standard risk factors for aspergillosis and mucormycosis? These are all the standard risk factors. Hem-onc setting, when the neutropenia is there, when we do solid organ transplants, when the person has got underlying malignancy, particularly allogenic stem cells or something there, the chances of getting it. Prolonged corticosteroids. People are talking about 0.3 milligram per kilogram of prednisolone for more than 20 days or more than 15 days is a risk factor. Here, COVID era, this is one of the important risk factors. People are using corticosteroids for longer time. Usual recommendations according to recovery trial is 10 days. Maximum we can go 14 days. But once the person's oxygen requirement is not happening, the treating team, they want to continue the steroids 4 weeks, 6 weeks also we are treated. Some of the patient discharged with the high doses of steroids. So this is one of the thing. But according to RCT, this is not a thing. But RCT, during hospital stay only they're calculating. After hospital stay, they're not doing it there. So these are all the standard risk factors. And if you see what are all the risk factors for aspergillosis, the risk factors is previously I told leukemia, neutropenia, organ transplantations, and different terms of biological agents like infliximab, rituximab, and other thing there. In 2009, influenza is added as one of the risk factors. Influenza-associated aspergillosis is called IAPA. Influenza-associated pulmonary aspergillosis, IAPA we call. But now in 2020 onwards, COVID-associated pulmonary aspergillosis, CAPA is coming. So this is how events are happening. Now CAPA, COVID is one of the important risk factors for aspergillosis according to the recent studies there. Then how about TB and COVID? Yes, diabetes is one of the important risk factors. Poverty is one of the important risk factors. Pollution is one of the important risk factors. Country like India, all three is there. We are the world number one in diabetes. The poverty and pollution is still there. So we have got it. In addition, COVID, what it made, one, COVID can cause an immunomodulatory effect on your lung tissues that can reactivate one, or because of the treatment, what we are using, the immunosuppressions, that can reactivate your tuberculosis bacilli. So this is the reasons they are putting in this review article, nicely written by Indian authors. It clearly showed this is an interplay between all three. Already the existing factors are there. Diabetes is there, poverty is there, pollution is there. But during initial stage of lockdown, people have stayed together. Usually, when you stay together, one of the family members got affected in a closed environment. They're spending time almost 18 to 24 hours in a day together. The chances of developing tuberculosis in other family members is very high. The persons go away in a work or something, they're coming back and sleeping in 6 to 8 hours in the night time, the risk is bit low. On the other hand, during lockdown, lot of overcrowding happening within a poor community. They stay together in one or two rooms. They stay together, and the chances of transferring tuberculosis to the other family members has also happened. So this is a risk factor for tuberculosis. Then why we need to bother about the secondary bacterial infections and fungal infections? Even though the numbers of bacterial infections is bit low, but the mortality it causes is very high. The morbidity it causes is very high. When a person got a secondary bacterial infections, the length of stay is much higher. The length of stay is much higher. You need to spend a lot of time in the ICU, lot of antibiotics, so the cost also can go up. But despite the thing, the person went into sepsis, the death rate is very high. Similarly, the fungal infections is also very high. This is a post-mortem study. What is the impact of the secondary bacterial infections? They clearly put it. The person has got proven infections, particularly more of proven bacterial as well as fungal infections. The mortality is 8% higher. Possible infections, the mortality is almost 24% higher there. So usually the chances of proven cases increases the mortality. On an average, the secondary bacterial infection causes 3% extra death. 3% extra death because of the sepsis or because of the septic shock, the person losing their life, 3% occasions, most of the time with COVID associated. How about aspergillosis? How about aspergillosis? A lot of data is there, particularly when the person has got proven invasive aspergillosis, the death rate can go up to 80% there. On average, it is 50% of the time the death is very high. So for bacterial infections, proven cases, 3 to 5% I can put it there. But for aspergillosis, the death rate can go up to 50% on average. If the person has got a proven galactomannan beta-glucan positive proven secondary aspergillosis infection, the death rate can go up to 80% above. So this is why we need to worry about it. We need to suspicious about these things and try to manage it. How about COVID and TB? Because of the delayed diagnosis. Once a diagnosis is got delayed, the chances of death can go up. According to WHO, clearly mentioned that delayed diagnosis is one of the important risks there because people fail to approach at appropriate time. That is a reason for it there. How about management of COVID infections? What we need to do? What we need to do? We need to have a good surveillance system. That is a bottom line. We need to have a good surveillance system to diagnose these infections. Unless we diagnose these infections, it's a bit difficult. So we need to have a good diagnostic modalities. Our clinical threshold or suspicion should be a bit low. And we need to have a good antibiotic stewardship. We can't put the antibiotics and think secondary bacterial infections will not come up. Actually, if we start using antibiotic, the resistant bugs will come up. The bacteria is more intelligent. It start producing resistant mechanisms and get away with whatever antibiotic. People think I put meropenem, I put vancomycin, I can get away with it. It start producing carbapenem resistant organisms and vancomycin resistant enterococci, or it can lead to candida also there. So we need to have a good antibiotic stewardship. Unfortunately, the diagnostic stewardship is lacking here. So a lot of multi-drug resistant organisms, I told clearly, Candida auris is emerging. A lot of carbapenem resistant gram-negative bacteria has emerged. MRSA emerged. Vancomycin resistant enterococci has emerged during COVID epidemic. This data we are going to set, we are going to see in future now. A diagnostic tool. I told about it's easy to make a diagnosis of Candida there. Yes, Candida is easy to grow compared to other two funguses. Compared to bacteria, it's a bit difficult to grow, but compared to Aspergillus and mucormycosis, Candida can grow in the urine, Candida can grow in the blood. But how about Aspergillosis? The growth can happen, but growth can happen fewer times compared to other two things. And second thing, the sensitivity and specificity of the biomarker. Usually we use galactomannan, even though it is not widely available, but galactomannan is one of the sensitive marker. In neutropenic setting, the galactomannan yield is much higher. On the other hand, non-neutropenic setting, and particularly kappa setting, COVID-associated pulmonary aspergillosis, galactomannan is not elevated most of the time. Unless very advanced disease, tissue invasion is there, but angio invasion is bit less. When the angio invasion happens, galactomannan can go up. Tissue invasion does not cause a galactomannan go up. But once a galactomannan is raised, the the mortality can go up. Similarly, the beta-D-glucan. But these two markers is not going to help you for your mucormycosis. These two markers can help you for aspergillosis, and beta-D-glucan can help you for candida. But for mucormycosis, only the tissue diagnosis. Unfortunately, people are not doing tissue diagnosis. Even radiologists fail to do the tissue diagnosis. Initial month bronchoscopy and bronchoscopy assisted biopsy was missing there. But of late, the October, November onwards, we have started seeing a lot of bronchoscopies and biopsies there. So very poor sensitivity. If you see the sensitivity of angioinvasion, neutropenic setting, garotamannan 70% sensitive. Non-neutropenic, non-COVID setting, it has got a 65% to 50% sensitivity. But in Kappa, COVID-associated situations, the galantamannase has got 6% sensitivity. But once it is positive, the prognosis is bad. According to the literature, once it is positive, that means angioinvasion started, the prognosis is bad. So sensitivity and specificity of diagnostic method is lacking. It is not widely available, and tissue diagnosis, most of the time it is not done during COVID time. Then how about the management? So far, only two things is working. One, steroid saving the life. Two, tocilizumab had added in the club. It can save the life. No other thing there. For example, remdesivir. Remdesivir can cut down your hospital stay by 1 day, but it won't save the life. It won't prevent your mechanical ventilations. According to the literature, whatever, according to Solidarity trial, remdesivir has got no role. But according to the HACT trial, it showed 1 day reductions in the hospital stay. But steroids and tocilizumab save the life there. So people are abused a lot of antibiotics and other things like hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin. Now the favorite thing is colchicine. People are trying this colchicine for everything there. But people tried BCG also there. What happened? It increases a BCG shortage across the developed world. Because developed world, the availability of BCG vaccine is a big challenge. They thought the BCG related immune stimulations can prevent COVID. So like hydroxychloroquine, like azithromycin, colchicine, they tried BCG, but large scale trials are going on. We need to wait for the data. According to the epidemiological studies, for example, where the BCG vaccination is practiced, the severity and death is bit less. Where the BCG vaccination is not practiced, the death is very high. This epidemiological link has been shown in a couple of studies, but there is no direct clinical benefit because of the BCG has not been demonstrated. We have seen a lot of side effects where when BCG start injected into the skin, and a lot of side effects we have seen there. What about prophylactic antibiotic? These couple of studies clearly answered the role of prophylactic antibiotic. People use azithromycin in the month of April, May 2020 there. In spite of using azithromycin, there is no benefit of secondary prevention there. Doxycycline showed a little bit of benefit, but there's no clear-cut benefit there. So if you give prophylactically antibiotic for all patients diagnosed with COVID, it has got no role. That's the bottom line there. We need to make a diagnosis. We need to prove the diagnosis, and we need to start appropriate antibiotic to get the answer. That's most important thing. Then how about rifampicin? We need to think about the drug interactions. Like people use azithromycin, chloroquine and rifampicin. Similarly, people use lopinavir, ritonavir along with rifampicin there. So we need to think about it. Remdesivir, the interaction is there, very minimal interaction there. We need to think about these interactions also before doing it, because some of the tuberculosis patients, they also get COVID during the hospitalizations or during the travel to the hospital, they got COVID. So we need to think about the drug interactions. Unnecessary drugs should be avoided for a patient with tuberculosis there. So what happened to my case? This patient's, the central line is growing, Klebsiella pneumoniae, carbapenem resistant organism there. The ET secretion also grown the same thing there. Both the central line as well as ET secretion, same sensitivity pattern. So the person admitted with COVID, severe ARDS, progressively improving till next 15 days. After 15 days of hospital stay, the person went into Klebsiella pneumoniae, hospital acquired ventilator associated pneumonia he developed with bacteremia. And we started with appropriate antibiotic. He's showing signs of improvement. Last couple of days, his weaning has started there. The person has come down to now with a tracheal mask. Even though we went into tracheostomy, we put him a tracheal mask and slowly weaning, conscious, now afebrile, completed the course of antibiotic there. So he's showing signs of improvement, planning to shift to HTU. So patient got admitted on 7th of February till 7th of March staying in the ICU. Because of the cost, the treatment of antibiotics is further costly. Staying in the ICU because of the secondary infections is a problem there. What about Kappa? Our experiences there, almost 2,000 hot patients between the month of April and November we treated there, and 250 odd patients went into ICU and ventilator there. Out of 250 odd patients, 16 patients. That means 6.3% of kappa has happened in our institution there. Most of the time, the HTS is very difficult to help out. People talking about the, what do you call, the hair crescent sign, the person has got these things. But in the presence of COVID, the chances of having typical CT scan that suggests aspergillosis is missing here. Neutropenic host, this thing can happen. But in the COVID era, this is classically missing there. So what is the incidence? Most of the people received steroid. Most of the people received immunosuppression therapy. And some people on echinocandin prophylaxis, they started getting the aspergillosis. Similarly, voriconazole prophylaxis started. Still, in spite of voriconazole, proven aspergillosis happened there. Culture is got much but healed. Galantamine and beta-D-glucan is not helping there for kappa. That's one problem there. Compared to the neutropenic, compared to the influenza-associated pulmonary aspergillosis, kappa-associated pulmonary aspergillosis, galactamannan yield, beta-D-glucan yield is not great. That's one thing. Echinocandin prophylaxis increases the risk also. It is not preventing 100%. Even voriconazole may fail. So this is our incidence in Chennai. How about mucormycosis? This is tip of iceberg what we have seen. Again, we presented in one of the recent conferences there. A lot of mucormycosis is happening. The study is started across India. We need to wait for the data. Yes, but the timeline is very varying. It can happen 2 months later also, 3 months later also it's possible. So a lot of people getting infections a bit later there. So what should be a treatment approach? First thing, we need to treat the COVID. If you want to have a good treatment available there, treat the COVID. Try to reduce your immunosuppression there, whatever immunosuppressions. People start using very high doses of steroids. When the person is not requiring oxygen, don't use steroids. Studies have clearly demonstrated people who are hypoxic, people who are oxygen dependent, that point of time steroid has got role. Unfortunately, people are using steroid most of the time without any proven benefit. So think about the steroids only when it is required. Third thing, antibiotics and antifungal therapy, judicious use. We need to have some set of rules should be followed, whether the person's chances of secondary infections. Very difficult to predict. I know CRP is a bit high. Procalcitonin, sometimes it's not helping out. So based upon the clinical presentations and try to send an appropriate sample for cultures or some histopathology, then you think about starting antifungal. Angio invasion is a time, but the mortality is also very high. So what algorithm we need to follow? Once the person, usually patient admitted in the ward side, when there is no fever, there is no need for any antibiotic. When the person is admitted to the HTU or ICU and COVID PCR is positive, the person has got clinical worsening. Unfortunately, clinical worsening people are not picking up. So clinical worsening, for example, persisting high temperature. After a period of 5 to 7 days, there's no fever, again fever is coming back. Oxygen requirement again going back. Radiological worsening can happen. Or if you're able to get the galantamine or beta-D-glucan that is very high, then we think about it, something is happening there, and we need to rule out pulmonary embolism, non-infectious etiology also there, because that also can cause fever, that increases your oxygen requirement, that new changes in your radiological pictures. So rule out pulmonary embolism, other non-infectious causes before thinking about the secondary infections. If you think secondary infection, send appropriate sample. The blood cultures, if you think the person has got bacteria, if you think the person has got candida, send blood cultures or appropriate cultures. And if you think the person has got fungus, either tissue for biopsy or tissue for galantamine and beta-D-glucan or BAL specimen. Worst scenario, some of the people are taking ET, but ideal thing is non-bronchoscopic or non-blinded BAL you can take, the specimen of fluid you can take and send for galantamine and beta-D-glucan. So we need to rule out consistently 2 procalcitonin, and the clinical picture does not suggest don't start antibiotic. So we need to start antibiotic and anti-infective therapy like fungus as well, but the duration should be kept very minimal. That's the approach we need to follow there. Way forward, we need to have a good surveillance system. We need to define how long we need to follow the patients and what are all the diagnostic methods we need to use to make a diagnosis of secondary bacterial and fungal infections in COVID era. We need to have a surveillance system. That's what's happening for the mucormycosis. For aspergillosis and bacteria, we need to create a good surveillance system to find out what secondary infections is happening. That is most important thing there. So in summary, the secondary infections is happening. Even though bacterial secondary infection is a bit less in Indian scenario, we are having a lot of candida infections, mucor infections is going up. Aspergillosis may be there, but there is no good biomarker available freely everywhere to everybody there. For example, galantamine and beta-glucan is not available, and tissue diagnosis is also not happening. Prophylactic antibiotic and antifungal has got no role. I have shown the data, echinocandin, people still developing aspergillosis, people receive broad spectrum antibiotics, still they're getting secondary infection there. Clinical worsening and radiological worsening should given a weightage and look for biomarker. If it is available, look for the biomarkers. But good infection control, we need to change this overall, the PPE, what we are using in the month of April and May. What is required? Good N95 mask is required. Good hand hygiene is required. If you go close to the patients, ordinary surgical gown is required. It's not overall. Overall, it's got no benefit. It creates a lot of suffocation to you there and everything there. We need to protect by wearing an appropriate mask, appropriate high protections, along with the gloves, with some surgical gown or even ordinary apron is fine when you go near the patients and examine the patients. So we need to use your PPE judiciously and more importantly, antibiotic judiciously to prevent the resistant infections as well as breakthrough infections there. People are thinking about antibiotic and antifungal, but we need to think about hand hygiene and antibiotic stewardship, antimicrobial stewardship. That is a better way of dealing secondary infection there. I got a small startup called Best of IDs. If you're interested in learning infectious diseases, a lot of certification courses is coming up. You can learn online. If you want in-person training also, it's possible to get antibiotic, antifungal stewardship, infection controls, everything will be taught in this Best of IDs. We can learn it there. If you want, you can message me through the WhatsApp or you can contact our website. So this is a place you can learn infectious diseases either online or offline there. Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suresh, for that exhaustive presentation covering all the possible infections in post-COVID, including tuberculosis. So there are questions coming from the audience. Before that, I would like to ask you, is the incidence of mucormycosis in COVID-19, actually in post-COVID-19, is it more compared to the incidence of mucormycosis in non-COVID cases?
Yes, I can show my data, my hospital data. It is definitely on rise. What I have seen in the year 2019 and 2018, we compared to 2018 and 2019, the number of cases of mucormycosis in 2020 is bit high, and we need to monitor in 2021 also. As I told earlier, post-COVID, the timeline is not defined, particularly for mucormycosis. It can happen bit later also there. So we need to follow a little longer, up to 6 months. I can put it May 2021. So far in 2020, yes, our number has gone up. Similar trend, my colleagues also discussing in social media platforms, saying that they're also seeing rising trend. That is why we started nationwide surveillance for mucormycosis, because this is easy to diagnose. There's no need for culture. Histopathology is the only gold standard. People are diagnosing it. And most of the time, the mucor happening in sinoorbital region. It is not happening in the lung. So there is no need for bronchoscopy or any CT-guided invasive procedure. People getting the sample from either the sinus tissue or orbital tissues, or even from the dental tissue, they're getting it there. So an histopathology is easy to demonstrate the mucormycosis. That's why I told, compared to aspergillosis, mucor diagnosis is much easier. And awareness among the clinician, because newspapers, social media, they're discussing. So people are thinking mucor very early at this stage now.
So as the pulmonologist, we use steroids for most of our cases. For example, interstitial lung diseases like steroid-sensitive interstitial lung disease, where we use steroids for months together. Even for COPD exacerbations, we give sometimes the pulse steroids also. So what makes this COVID lung more prone for this deadly fungal infections? Is it only the steroid or anything else?
So this is due to multiple reasons, not only steroids. As you rightly pointed out, we are using steroids and other immunosuppressions, even not only in the lung diseases, in other diseases also. For example, the transplant scenarios and even rheumatologists and other connective tissue disease settings, we are using a lot of steroids. I agree with you. But in COVID, apart from the thing, because of the severe ARDS, it is lasting quite some time, one, and people are using a lot of other things like antibiotics and other things that increases the risk of your candida and other fungal infections, but not mucormycosis. But apart from the thing, the air handling systems, as well as people are keeping in a crowded, because we are lacking staff. So we need to keep the patients in a crowded ICUs there, and compared to hair handling system that is not cleaned properly. Most of the time we are handling the hair handling clinics every month or every third month we are doing routinely. But during the time of COVID, people reluctant to go and do the little engineering works during the COVID era also. That is also one of the reasons we have thought about it, because of the poor infection control practices we adopted there. The routine cleaning and routine environmental monitoring services also got affected there. So a lot of factors is playing a role apart from the steroid. Yes, I agree with you. Not only the steroids, but other thing, maybe the COVID related changes in the respiratory tract, that also we need to look into the thing. And third thing, depending upon the engineering controls in the hospitals and ICU, that plays a big role.
So is any role of tropical climate for this increased mucormycosis in India? Because we are seeing, if we go through the literature, aspergillosis is reported more commonly in outside India, and in India it is mucormycosis which is most reported. So any role of tropical climate?
Yeah, apart from the tropical climate, we have seen mucor in India is quite common compared to the Western world. Even before COVID, we see a lot of mucor compared to the Western world. Only thing, the awareness is lacking that point of time. Now COVID has created the awareness one. And see, apart from the tropical climate, India is also vulnerable because we got a lot of diabetic populations and undiagnosed diabetic populations. During the time of COVID, we have found out more newly diagnosed diabetic with the sugar levels of 450, 500, or people claiming I'm a good control people, I'm not taking any diabetic medications, and they presented within couple of days of dexamethasone, particularly not very high dexamethasone, 6 milligram to 8 milligram once a day dexamethasone, the sugar levels went up to 500, 550 there. And if you check the HbA1c, the HbA1c is very high. So there is a hidden diabetic going on, the hidden diabetic epidemic is going on with the tropical climate scenario. And I told what will happen, the mucor may be present in our environment also. That is causing the problem now.
Dr. Kansal from Meerut is asking, how long should antibiotics be given because the symptoms persist for quite long? You said antibiotics therapy can also lead to this secondary infections, longer antibiotic therapy.
Compared to my previous two questions, it's easy to answer there. The duration of COVID, particularly the treatment of antibiotics, is very clearly defined. Previously, we used to treat longer, but nowadays, whether it's COVID or non-COVID, the durations for VAP or durations of hospital-acquired infections, the duration has been cut down. For example, previously, we are treating VAP for 14 days. Now, good randomized control trials showing the benefit, 7 days or maximum 8 days is equal to 15 days there. A lot of data is there. The same rule applies to the COVID. So don't extend the duration, not more than 8 to 10 days for me, even for ventilator-associated pneumonia. Similarly, for CLABSI, depending upon the organisms, if the organism is a gram-negative, it can go up to 10 to 14 days, not more than 14 days. If it is tend to be a simple MSSA or something, just 7 to 10 days is also fine. Unless some resistant bug like MRSA or Candida, we need to treat longer. Other bugs we need to treat. The thumb rule, 10 to 14 days is a rule, you can keep it there.
Dr. Sangeeta from Tamil Nadu is asking, what is post-COVID pneumonia?
Usually the post-COVID pneumonia can be due to anything what we have discussed here, because of the bacterial process or because of the fungal process, whatever can cause. Pneumonia is basically a bacterial infections, people define there. But in post-COVID era, funguses also can cause pneumonia there. So there is no specific term like I can what is post-COVID pneumonia. Post-COVID secondary infections is common entity. In the secondary infections, the bacterial process or whether it is a fungal process is possible there. Among the funguses, either mucormycosis, aspergillosis is quite common, and bacteria, anything can possible. Either gram-positive organisms, gram-negative, some of the atypical organisms like Mycoplasma, Legionella also can common. But risk factor for resistant bug is there because of ICU stay, antibiotic, central line, and people are using antibiotic upfront. People are using ceftriaxone, some people are using piperacillin tazobactam, some people are using meropenem. That is the problem there. So post-COVID pneumonia is any of the secondary infections happening in the lung.
So Murugan from Chennai asks, these patients require Septron prophylaxis because they are on high dose of steroids?
Yeah, once the rule of thumb says when a dexamethasone dosage, particularly not dexamethasone, if you use prednisolone more than 20 milligram a day for 2 to 3 weeks, we need to give cotrimoxazole prophylaxis to prevent PCP or PJP. We call penicillin. We need to provide the PCP prophylaxis, Pneumocystis carinii or Pneumocystis jirovecii pneumonia prophylaxis is needed there. So yes, but most of the time, if you see the recovery trial and other recommendations, they're recommending only 10 to 14 days of steroid. But some of the population, some of the patients, they require longer ICU stay. The ARDS is not improving. People keep on extending the steroids. And sometimes we are giving post-COVID pulmonary fibrosis. People are using steroids in a larger doses. That point of time, when you crosses more than 15 days of steroids, and particularly the dosage is more than 20 milligram, yes, you need to give PCP prophylaxis there.
So we are seeing more cases of MDR-TB post-COVID. What may be the reason for this?
Usually, there is no direct relationship. I also check about the MDR and XDR-TB, but couple of studies what I quoted is also showing MDR-TB incidence is slightly up, but there is no direct relationship with COVID and TB. Only thing, people who are not following up regularly or people who lost to follow up, that may be the reasons, or because COVID medicines also like azithromycin, whatever we're using, azithromycin has got at least the azithromycin has got very minimal TB action, but people are using only 5 to 7 days only there. And some people are using levofloxacin and linezolid that may have got TB effects, so that may increases your MDR-TB resistance. People are using more levofloxacin, more linezolid. These are all got TB effect. So if you are using inappropriately, it may increase a thing, but there is no direct relationship between COVID and MDR-TB.
Sir, is there any role of human placental extract as adjuvant in the management of COVID infection?
So far, I have not used it. I don't have any good data to show it there. We treated more than 5,000 hot patients in our institutions from last March onwards to this March onwards, but we have not used it there. I need to check any RCTs has got it, but I don't come across anything so far.
So when we come to the treatment of these fungal infections, most of the antifungals are nephrotoxic. And even the COVID-19 patients, they have deranged RFT. So how to manage in such difficult condition?
Usually we are using 2 antifungals commonly. One is voriconazole for aspergillosis. If you think the person has got aspergillosis, using voriconazole, or if you think the person has got mucormycosis, we need to go with amphotericin B. In the amphotericin B, liposomal amphotericin B is least nephrotoxic. Yes, it has also got nephrotoxicity potential, but compared to plain amphotericin B, liposomal has got bit less toxicity, but only thing the cost can go up. Once you think the patient has got candida, we are using either fluconazole versus echinocandin there. Fluconazole and echinocandin is more safe, but voriconazole in tablet form, it is more safer form compared to IV voriconazole because the cyclodextrin in the IV that causes a nephrotoxicity. As far as amphotericin B is concerned, if money is not a concern, liposomal amphotericin B, the nephrotoxicity concern is not great. But off late, we got a couple of newer azoles called isavuconazole has come into the market. Isavuconazole has got more safer option. It has got more better option compared to your voriconazole because it covers both aspergillosis, it covers both mucormycosis. Even though for mucormycosis, this is not standard of care, but we can use isavuconazole if you think the person has got nephrotoxicity or other concern. That will cover both your aspergillosis and cover mucormycosis. And posaconazole available in the tablet form also. If the patient is taking only, we can try posa also there. So options are there with less nephrotoxicity off late.
So Dr. Kulkarni from Bangalore, he is asking which infections precede fungal and bacterial in post-COVID phase?
Usually bacterial infection precedes first because bacterial infections is more common in immediate area. For example, the patient admitted 10 days or 15 days with ICU, ventilator support and lines, bacterial infections can happen, followed by candida, then only aspergillosis and mucor is going to happen there. So in immediate phase before aspergillosis and mucor, either bacterial, followed by candida, then only aspergillosis and mucor will happen.
So you talked about candidiasis, COVID-associated candidiasis. Which sites are most affected by this candidiasis?
People are growing candida from the ET secretions and everything. Candida never causes candida pneumonia, even in COVID patients. Candida can cause pneumonia only in 2 settings. post lung transplant with a lot of immunosuppressions, yes, we can think about it, or hemong setting, bone marrow transplant, following a graft versus host disease, that point of time, a lot of immunosuppression going on, that time you think about Candida pneumonia. Otherwise, pneumonia, don't think Candida as a causative agent. Only thing, it is a risk factor for invasive candidiasis or disseminated candidiasis there. So commoner site of Candida for me is urinary tract infections. Second commoner site is a central line associated infections. Rarely we came across invasive candidiasis that involve spleen, liver and disseminated form of candidiasis you have seen there. But never Candida pneumonia there. COVID is not, never causes Candida pneumonia. It causes urinary tract infections, Candiduria and Candidal UTI. It can cause Candida-associated line-related bloodstream infections. It can cause invasive candidiasis that involves liver, spleen, and other internal organs there.
So you said the mucormycosis is easy to diagnose than aspergillosis. So is there any role of screening for aspergillosis, like serum galactomannan or 1,3-beta-D-glucan?
Yeah, people are talking about routinely they want to give, for example, antibiotic people are using for most of the COVID patients and the patient is sick. Similarly, they are talking about antifungal routinely prophylaxis, whether need to give to prevent aspergillosis or mucormycosis there. But the problem is routine prophylaxis that will increase your antifungal resistance. That is a problematic. And second thing, breakthrough fungal infections can happen. These two things is a problem there. So we need to follow some strategy when to stop or when to escalate the antifungal. The best thing is we need to go with the biomarker. Unfortunately, the galactomannan is not available freely. Beta-D-glucan is also not that freely. But of late, a lot of hospitals start measuring the beta-D-glucan and galactomannan there. So you can do two things. The pre-empty strategy we call. Instead of prophylactically blindly giving the antifungal, you do weekly biomarkers or weekly twice biomarker. If the cost is not a concern, weekly twice biomarker. If the biomarker levels are a bit high, continue the antifungal prophylaxis. If the biomarkers are consistently negative, it has got very good negative predictive value. If it is consistently negative, you can stop your antifungals.
So one last question from my side. You are the best person to answer it. Are we going to face second wave?
Right now, yes, we are seeing slightly rising trend there. Whatever experiences from US and Europe, what it shows, the US and Europe particularly hit the first wave in the month of March and April. The peak happened in the month of March and April. The next 6 to 7 months, they went into plateau phase there. Again, in the month of November, December, the peak happened. Usually the timeline is 6 to 7 months, where whatever herd immunity we are talking about, that can slowly wane off. The second week can happen there. Our peak hit in the month of August and September. So we are entering into the March and April. The 6 to 7 months phase is over. We are entering. But for us and US and UK, one difference is vaccination was not available in the month of November, December to US and Europe. But right now we are entering in with the vaccine there. How far the vaccine is going to prevent the second peak, we need to monitor. Otherwise, the natural immunity can go away. That is why last 15 days, 20 days, most of the hospitals in Chennai slightly seeing the trend there. Whatever COVID ward I closed couple of weeks back or couple of months back, last week I opened up there. I discussed with my Maharashtra colleagues. They're also feeling same thing there. And my Kerala colleagues, they are also saying the cases is going up. So almost 6 states is showing the trend, rising trend, even though the numbers are slightly less now, but we do not know whether we are going to behave like US, we are going to behave like UK, we do not know. Our second wave is taller compared to the first wave, or second wave is smaller compared to the first wave. We need to wait and watch. But second wave, it just entered, my gut says there.
So one very last question. In active COVID, along with mucormycosis, should we give steroids or not?
Usually we need to, the essential treatment of mucormycosis, first thing is a surgical therapy. If the disease is localized to any particular part of the body, that can be excised or that can be debrided. That's the first thing there. Because surgical clearance has got class 1 references or A references there. We need to do the surgical corrections. Second part is an antifungal part. We need to give the antifungal, ideally amphotericin B, that's the best choice there. The third thing you are coming about immunosuppressions. For example, before this COVID, we see a lot of mucor in post-transplant scenario, post-bone marrow transplant and solid organ transplants. What we usually do, we cut down the immunosuppressions. At least we can keep the immunosuppressions to the minimum. So in COVID era, if the first 15 days is over, the immunosuppression is not required. Definitely you can stop. If you are not able to stop the immunosuppression, keep the immunosuppression very minimum. Because these three things is needed. Surgical corrections along with antifungal, keep the immunosuppressions minimum. That's why one of the graph I put, treat the virus, keep the immunomodulations minimum, use antibiotics and antifungal in addition for mucous surgical corrections.
So thank you very much for this enlightening presentation. I think we have covered all the aspects of post-COVID infection. Any closing remarks from your side, sir?
Nothing there. This is one of the challenging talks, sir. Usually the secondary infections, as I told earlier, it's very difficult to define what is our timeline. And depending upon the surveillance method, what we are using, I told earlier, a lot of challenges is that it's very difficult to do whatever thing. Routinely in pre-COVID era, we do a lot of bronchoscopies, we are getting transbronchial biopsies, but now it's not possible during the initial stages, but of late we started doing it there. So the exact incidence and prevalence is lacking now. And similarly, when to start the antibiotic, because once a lot of antibiotic abuse is also happening. At the same time, we don't want to lose the patients. Once the patients come out of the COVID, I don't want to lose the patient because of the secondary bacterial infection there. So this is tricky situation for most of the treating clinicians, whether to use antibiotic without any diagnosis there, because the patient is having fever. That's a big challenge there. But we need to keep antibiotic stewardship principles in mind there. And third thing is infection control. Clearly, we need to have a good infection control practices. People thinking I'm putting a overall, I'm putting a gloves, I'm protecting it there. That's a mindset we need to change there. This bug cross, we are getting the bug by means of air, either by means of inhaling the thing, either means of droplet or airborne. That's a different story. But there's no need for putting a coverall, putting a glove there. We need to change the gloves or we need to do the hand rub there. I stop using the overalls now. I just go with my same dress with the N95 mask, with the face shield, and do frequent hand rub. I've stopped using gloves also. So we need to do these things for second wave. Unless we do this, a lot of secondary infections can happen there. And I thank the organizers for giving wonderful opportunity there.
Thank you once again, sir. From my side, on behalf of all the participants, I would like to thank Dr. Krishna, founder CCI, my friend Dr. Pradeep, Dr. Vijay Kumar, CCI webinar coordinator, Dr. Ravi Doshi, Dr. Narendra, Mr. Vipul, Vinod, technical team Cipla. Thank you all the participants and good night.
Good night.